Hello. Space Marine Power Armour is one of the most important visual designs in 40k, but the idea of Power Armour existed long before the 40k game did. It has origins in science fiction novels published many, many decades earlier. When the first edition of 40k, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, was released in 1987, it already featured the cover stars, the Space Marines, a group of Crimson Fists fighting for their lives, wearing their already iconic WIKI power armor. By the time 2nd edition came out in 1993, that WIKI power armor had already evolved into something even more iconic, the Mark VII power armor. But when did that transition and evolution take place? I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm exploring the origins and development history of Space Marine Power Armour. Rogue Trader, written by Rick Priestley and released in 1987, was the first edition of Warhammer 40,000, and it is quite different in many respects to the 40k that we would recognise today. But there are some fundamental similarities. Some of the roots and foundations of things that exist in the current game have their origins in Rogue Trader, including the central role of the Space Marines in the affairs of the 41st millennium. These very literal cover stars were described as being mankind's most feared fighting force, in small part because they recruited primarily from savage, feral worlds, and from Underhive gang scum who had the perfect level of true aggression and psychotic killer instinct. The vibes of the Space Marines may have changed a little over the years, and so have their outfits, but across all 10 editions and nearly 40 years of 40k history, the Space Marines have always worn their Sunday best. In this video, we'll look at the influences, origins, and early examples of power armor. Before we get started, don't forget to like this video if you like it, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. And if you could be very, very kind and mention Jordan Sorcery anywhere on the internet, just talk about the channel and the work I do here, that would be greatly appreciated. Of course, if you want to support my work even more, you can check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. Absolutely all of that stuff is really important, and I'm really super grateful. There is some debate about the earliest examples of powered armor in science fiction, if pulp comics tackled the idea first, and what exactly powered armor really means. But there is no doubt about some of the prime candidates for originating the idea, or at least putting them down in writing. Anthony Gilmore was the pseudonym used by Harry Bates and Desmond W. Hall, the editor and assistant editor of Astounding Stories of Super Science magazine. Later in his career, Bates would go on to write the story Farewell to the Master, which would be adapted into the film The Day the Earth Stood Still. Whilst they were still working together on Astounding Stories, Bates and Hall wrote a series of adventures in the 1930s, featuring a character called Hawk Cass, a sort of ray gun-toting space adventurer who was set against a Fu Manchu-style villain, Dr. Ku Sui. A lot of the Yellow Peril plotting has aged rather badly, but in the affair of the brains, there would feature something that has only matured and refined with age: the powered spacesuit. You'll find the spacesuits are equipped with small generators and gravity plates, which I helped Ku Sui develop. The switch and main control are in the left-hand glove. A few years later, E. Doc Smith would be writing his Lensman series of space opera science fiction stories. Beginning with Triplanetary, the series would chart a history of interstellar civilization over billions of years. Amongst the colossal space battles and destruction of entire worlds, there would be something of a space policeman, utilizing advanced technology known as the lens. The wearers of the lens, known as the lensman, would possess incredible abilities, but it wasn't initially clear if this was some kind of powered suit. However, in 1947's Children of the Lens, Smith would describe the lensman armor as something more recognizably powered. The lensman landed and made his way to Harkleroy's inner office in what seemed to be an ordinary enough, if somewhat oversized, suit of light space armor. But it was no more ordinary than it was light. It was a powerhouse, built of durium a quarter of an inch thick, Kinnison was not walking in it. He was merely the engineer of a battery of 2,000 horsepower motors. Unaided, he could not have lifted one leg of that armour off of the ground. By the end of the 50s, the concept of the powered suit would be ready for the big time, and author Robert Heinlein would fire it into the stratosphere. His science fiction novel Starship Troopers was published in 1959. It tells the story of intergalactic war prosecuted against the alien arachnids, including the actions of troopers in the mobile infantry. A particularly lasting influence of the book is its popularization and focus on the concept of powered armour. Heinlein's powered suits come in a number of different varieties, and they're described as turning a trooper into a steel gorilla, but there is only limited description of what those suits actually look like. A suit isn't a spacesuit, although it can serve as one. It is not primarily armour, although the Knights of the Round Table were not armoured as well as we are. It isn't a tank, but a single MI private could take on a squadron of those things and knock them off unassisted. Suited up, you look like a big steel gorilla, armed with gorilla-sized weapons. The real genius in the design is that you don't have to control the suit, you just wear it, like your clothes, like skin. The secret lies in negative feedback and amplification. Inspired by both his own experiences in Vietnam and wanting to respond to Heinlein's Starship Troopers, Joe Haldeman's 1974 book, The Forever War, tells the bleak story of soldiers involved in interstellar warfare and caught out by time dilation. A 2-year tour from the soldiers' perspective, started in 1995, wouldn't actually end until 2024. The troops of the United Nations Exploratory Force wore their own special kind of powered armour. I stripped and backed into the clamshelled suit. The new ones were a hell of a lot more complicated, with all the new biometrics and trauma maintenance, but well worth the trouble of hooking up, in case you got blown apart just a little bit. Go home to a comfortable pension with heroic prostheses. I finished the setup sequence and the suit closed by itself, gritted my teeth against the pain that never came when the internal sensors and fluid tubes poked into your body. Conditioned neural bypass, so you felt only a slight puzzling dislocation, rather than the death of 1,000 cuts. Other novels, like John Stakely's Armour from 1984, explored the powered armour concept in more detail as well. And of course there would be many more appearances for these kinds of powered armoured super troopers across the genre. The idea of powered armour had already become a standard part of the military science fiction milieu by the time Rogue Trader was being written. Much like fantasy had inherited these defaults of elves and dwarves thanks to Tolkien's work, and they appeared in many different versions of fantasy worlds, science fiction as a genre had inherited the soldier in a suit of powered armour. Rick Priestley was clearly familiar with the concept, but he said that he wasn't directly referencing Starship Troopers when he wrote about the Space Marines. Sometimes, I suspect that ideas make their way vicariously via other games or model ranges. For example, Starship Troopers by Heinlein, which may have inspired various model ranges over the years, but which I hadn't read prior to creating 40k. One of the games, and indeed model ranges, that likely had a significant impact on the creation of 40k setting, and the inclusion of Space Marines in Power Armour, was created by Citadel's own Brian Ansell, but it wasn't released by Citadel, and it was called Laseburn. Published by Tabletop Games in 1980 alongside a range of 15mm miniatures, Ansell's Laseburn was set in a future where mankind had reached the edge of the universe and the pinnacle of technological advancement before falling once again to barbarism. The game and its supplements, as well as its successor Imperial Commander, which was developed by Ansell and Warhammer co-creator Richard Halliwell, would include a number of ideas and elements that would find themselves a home amongst the later Citadel games. Tech like jet cycles, bolt guns, and dreadnought armour, and even Imperial Commander's Cult of the Red Redemption would all make a return in either 40k or Warhammer Fantasy. And you won't be surprised to hear, given the subject of this video, that Power Armour made an appearance in Laseburn as well. Power Armour. Strengthened armour plus plates, incorporating a motorised exoskeleton which duplicates the motions of the individual inside. Often incorporates weaponry and jetpack. Cost 500 credits plus the cost of any weaponry. Not available to the general public. Published a year after Laseburn as a rule set, but having been a range of miniatures for many years already, there was a rival sci-fi game released by Citadel. This one was called Spacefarers. Though Spacefarers hasn't had quite the same lasting influence as Laseburn, it did nonetheless feature a number of Power Armour troops of its own. Most impressive, in my opinion, was the S-27 Dark Disciple in Power Armour with heavy bolt rifle, a vision of futuristic powered armour seemingly modelled on the armour of a medieval knight, an approach to this kind of gear that we may see in the future. Citadel didn't just produce science fiction miniatures for their own game though, they were also acquiring licenses throughout the 80s for lots of different IPs, including stuff like Doctor Who and Star Trek. One that is particularly relevant here is the Traveller RPG, for which they made a series of miniatures, including some soldiers in something called Battle Dress. The ultimate in individual protection, Battle Dress is an advanced and powered version of combat armour. Battle Dress enhances the strength and senses of individuals wearing it, with variable feedback, personal controls, servo-powered limbs, and various kinds of electronic assistance. The individual wearing Battle Dress is effectively doubled in strength and given unlimited endurance. First published in 1977, Traveller was, for many, the quintessential science fiction role-playing game. Citadel's military range of models for the game included some of the battle dress wearing troopers, though they happen to look more like souped up NASA astronauts than anything we would see from later Citadel ranges for 40k. And speaking of Traveller, Mark Harrison wrote and illustrated the Traveller's comic for White Dwarf between issue 45 and issue 76, inspired by his own games of the Traveller RPG. In issue 64's chapter 13, we are treated to a full-page image of the character Gavin, wearing a suit of what looks very much like early Space Marine power armour. Issue 64 was published in April 1985, but the comic strip is dated to January that year. The reason that the date on the comic strip may be relevant is because 1985 would also see the creation and release of the first ever Space Marine miniature. Now, it's possible that the design in the comic influenced the miniature, or that the miniature's design influenced the comic, or they could have just been completely separate, a pure coincidence with no relationship whatsoever. In any case, Citadel would release in 1985 a miniature that was a game changer, the first Imperial Space Marine. LE2, or Limited Edition 2, or LE2, as he's been affectionately nicknamed since, was one of an early series of one-off sculpts made available for a limited period. Bob Naismith sculpted this brand new Imperial Marine as a single metal piece miniature, and though it is lacking the flared legs of later Marines, it already has many of the features that would become hallmarks of Space Marine design. These include the beaked helmet, a power backpack, and oversized studded pauldron. In the excellent book of interviews by Robin Dews and John Stallard, Talking Miniatures, Bob Naismith explained the design principles behind the Space Marines' pauldrons, starting with LE2. Well, you have to remember that we were all coming from a fantasy sculpting background. In Warhammer Fantasy, we'd already created the Chaos Warriors, and so we'd already created that larger-than-life, monstrous, threatening look. And we needed something similar, but we couldn't just put loads of spikes on them, so the studs went on. But we also knew that we wanted to be able to add chapter symbols, rank markings, IDs, and so on. So that's why one pad was always studded and the other one smooth. Other minis in the LE range would include forgotten classics like the Space Skeleton, Space Orc, and curiously enough, Space Santa. There was also another key mini too, LE10, the Power Armour Trooper. Whilst the design of this trooper was quite different to the Imperial Marine and future Space Marines, it's still worth noting that there were already experiments taking place to find the perfect look for power armour. And in this instance, it was power armour, not powered armour. By 1986, a number of new metal Imperial Marines would be available to form full squads of these super-duper troopers. Again, sculpted by Bob Naismith, the 8-strong range was advertised under the code C100 in an August 86 flyer. The price was £5.50 for the complete set. The pauldrons and beaks are present and correct, as are the backpacks, though they are very small and low slung on these minis. In the spring 1987 Citadel Journal, the C100 boys would be advertised again under the revised name Imperial Space Marines. And then later in 1987, the world would change forever when Rick Priestley's magnum opus Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader would make fantasy gaming seem like a thing of the past. and it would start Games Workshop on the road to total global domination. John Sibbick's unforgettable cover would centre on the plight of an unlucky band of Crimson Fist Space Marines, fully decked out in that Naismith armour that had already become a recognisable design. In fact, even in that first edition, the Space Marines are a major focus. Sure, there are lots of Xenos and lots of other stuff going on in the Imperium. It's certainly not exclusively Space Marines. But it's already clear that they are an object of fascination for the writers and for the creators of this game. There's loads of art and there's loads of amazing miniatures to come, all about the Space Marines. And although their character is a bit different, they are not quite the chivalric space knights they would become, more jerky space bastards, I guess. There is one thing about them that hasn't changed all that much: their clothes. Space Marines have always adored power armour. Powered armour consists of an all-enclosing protective suit, life support system, and many technically advanced features. The natural weight and cumbersomeness of the armour is overcome by a system of electrically motivated fibre bundles, which replicate in every way the muscular movements of the wearer. So, although heavy, the wearer is free to move without penalty. Autosense and communicator are included, together with respirators which enable the suit to be used in any atmosphere or hard vacuum. Controls are minimal. Most of the suit's functions are automatic. Control messages and hazard warning can be given by the suit either audibly or visually, and the suit's built-in computer will respond to vocal commands. The armour gives a saving throw of 4, 5, or 6 on a d6. It does not count as heavy equipment and confers no movement penalty. Like carapace armour, it is air-sealed. Powered armour can be combined with flak, but not mesh, giving a save of 3, 4, 5, or 6, and half-inch movement penalty. We have to take a moment here to dwell on perhaps the coolest single image in the Rogue Trader book. Illustrated by the artist known at the time only as H, this marine power armor technical diagram is one of a number of schematics in the book that are just simply brilliant. H's real name is Nicholas Coleman, and he also produced a wide range of technical illustrations, logos, and maps for GW during this period. But for me, it is the realism of these schematics that adds so much depth to the 40k universe from the very beginning. The LE2 Marine may have been the first of his kind, but it would be another release that would turn the Space Marines into the gaming equivalent of a household name. The first 40k Rogue Trader plastic box set, RTB01, the Imperial Space Marines. We knew that Warhammer 40,000 was coming out, and we wanted to have all the sculptors working on it, as many as possible anyway. In the end, it was essentially myself, Ali Morrison, Jez Goodwin, and the twins, Alan and Michael Perry. And as I remember, we kind of all sat around a table and we sculpted them together. One of us would do a bit on a model and then pass it on. The RTB01 box set included 17 plastic sprues, allowing for 30 Marines to be constructed, with different combinations of weapons, heavy weapons, flamers, and more. Naismith further explained about the design origins for the helmets and the power armor backpacks. Well, I think that look really came down to Jez. He was making the heads, and he developed that style of helmet, which always reminds me of an F4 Phantom jet with that curl on top. The backpacks were mine, though. What I had in mind were the backpacks used by the Doughboys, the name given to World War I American infantry. Their backpacks consisted of 2 or 3 smaller packs, nested on top of each other with a bedroll on top. So that was the shape I had in mind, and I just reinvented the bedroll as the 2 breathing filtration vents on the top and sides. You see, all this stuff comes from somewhere, just filtered through the mind of a designer. This box of multi-part plastic Imperial Space Marines was an enormous success for Games Workshop, helping to establish 40k as a dominant war game in the range, and it would also help to prove the case for the heavy investment required for plastic kits at Games Workshop. But it was interesting to note that it wasn't the only multi-part Space Marine that was being explored around the time. There were also experiments with metal. Discovered in Tim Pollard's collection and shared online by the ELDRITCH EPISTLES blog, this metal miniature is an early example of attempts to fashion a different kind of multi-part Space Marine. Ultimately, it went unreleased, but it retained all of the key signifiers that had quickly come to define the Space Marine look. With Rogue Trader and the RTB01 box set flying off the shelves, it was clear that Space Marines were now a thing. But that didn't stop artists and sculptors from iterating on the design and looking for brand new ways to explore these mighty space warriors. There would be plenty of new Marine models in metal, and the introduction of tactical dreadnought armor wearing Terminator Marines would further expand the range. These Terminators would go through some real-time design iterations of their own, as Jez Goodwin and Bob Naismith traded approaches and miniature releases. And instead of a regular Marine's beaky helmet, they seem to favour snub-nosed grilled masks, like the Terminator design that was included in Space Hulk. By late 1988, there would also be a number of Space Marine chaplains, sculpted by Mark Copplestone, whose backpacks were more pronounced and whose beaky noses were less so. In fact, these seem to share some design similarities with those snub-nosed Terminators. Of course, there was a huge amount of new art and miniatures being produced during this time that featured the Space Marines, and if you weren't paying close attention, it would be easy to miss stuff. But some changes were so significant that they would be hard to miss. And if you were looking at the covers of White Dwarf as August 1989 rolled into September, you would see something shocking. The cover of White Dwarf 116 in August 89 featured the increasingly popular Ultramarines, some of whom were wearing the traditional beaky helmeted power armor. The following month, with September's issue 117, artist Jim Burns would announce to the world that a change was coming. This was the first appearance, anywhere as far as I can tell, of what would later become retroactively named the Mark VII power armor. Although the significant design overhaul goes unremarked upon in the issue, there is a clear expression of the importance this new look will have in the 40k of the future. On the contents page, Jim Burns' cover art is described as the definitive picture of Space Marines. Jim's art captures the awesome power of the Imperium's finest warriors superbly. This image would go on to feature on multiple covers, including the Space Marine boxed set, the Horus Heresy wargame, the cover of Ian Watson's novel Space Marine, and just a whole lot of other places. It can be quite difficult to get really specific release dates for miniatures around this time, because you have to go by flyers and catalogues and White Dwarves, and not everything is in those lists. It's really tough to get really specific. But as far as I can tell, in the next few months, people would get their first glimpse of new miniatures and new Marines. The catalogue pages at the back of White Dwarf issue 120 from December 89 showed off the available blisters of Space Marines sculpted by Bob Naismith, Ali Morrison, and Mark Copplestone. Each blister pack included 3 Marines, and several of them had a Marine with a different kind of helmet. These various helmets were much more in the style of these Terminators and Chaplains that we'd seen already, and they would later receive their own armour designations. The following issue, 121, would feature a showcase of Kevin Walker's art, including a page from the never-to-be-published Warhammer comic. Walker was slated to illustrate the story about a Space Marine captain, and it seems like Captain Black was already wearing a later mark of power armour. But he wasn't the only Marine who was trying out different outfits early. In fact, in issue 123, there would be an entire heavy metal page featuring spectacular Space Marines, including a handful of Marines in so-called armour variants. All would be explained in September 1990, when White Dwarf 129 featured an article written by Rick Priestley with accompanying art by John Blanche that dived into the deep lore of Space Marine armour variants. It would be in this White Dwarf that the armour designations would be written down and published for the first time. Most humans who have any contact with Space Marines will know and recognise the most common types of Space Marine armour quite readily. However, there are other older types which remain in service to this day, and which are very different in their design. Many of the older variants have special associations for particular chapters, and may be worn by ceremonial guards or by elite units, for example. Other Space Marine chapters are less formal in their use of armour, mixing various types into their fighting units with little or no regard for conformity. The article would go on to explore the Age of Strife, and then talk about the earliest Mark I armour. That featured a massive powered torso, but did not have powered legs or powered arms, and was not fully enclosed. After that, it would get into the next iterations of power armour. Mark II, the Crusade suit, is the first fully enclosed, life-sustaining power armour, enabling fighting in deep space and on alien worlds alike, much in the fashion of the powered armour of the later Lensman or Traveller's battle dress. This was the in-universe beginning of true power armour, and it seemed to be where we changed from using powered as an adjective to power as a noun. Mark III, also known as Iron Armour, was not a replacement for the Crusade suits, but an optional variant that offered significantly heavier armour at the cost of manoeuvrability. In 40k terms, it was a step closer to Terminator armour, and from a broader sci-fi perspective, it reads somewhat like the description of Heinlein's powered armour, with a certain steel gorilla aspect to it all. Mark IV armour was created to improve flexibility and featured external power cabling and a proto-beaky helmet design, named the Imperial Maximus suit. There is a certain hint of Zardos to this that I think looks quite fun. Wayne England painted an ace piece that appears to feature the Mark IV Marines having a traditionally bad time of things. The next iteration of Power Armour was Mark V, which was halfway through its rollout when the Horus Heresy got started, and interstellar logistics became understandably more complex. Unfortunately, most of the suits that had been shipped out ended up in the hands of now traitorous legions. For this reason, the Mark V was a relatively short-lived iteration, and it earned the nickname the Heresy suit. The exposed cabling on this design ties this image back to many of the representations of Space Marine power armour in Rogue Trader. Mark VI would be the legendary Corvus suit, with the full beaky helmet and single-studded pauldron that had been the basic Space Marine miniature since Naismith's LE2 design. The cleaner chest armour was said to result from the power cables being rehoused beneath the chest plate, and the addition of a single smooth pauldron was now explained as a wartime need to conserve materials. It's fascinating to see how the look of the Space Marine that we had all been accustomed to at this point, that had existed for pretty much all of Rogue Trader's life, was repositioned as a contemporary version of something much, much older, with previous iterations now explained in the lore. And then there would be the introduction of something, and I've said this word many times already in this video, but it really is true, something iconic: the Mark VII Space Marine Power Armour. Later in the same issue, there would be a feature on Space Marine paint schemes that reinforced the idea that the default Marine was now wearing Mark VII Armorum Impetor armour, also known as Eagle armour. It wasn't referred to at the time as Aquila armour, but that would become the common term for it at some later point. There was also an heavy metal showcase with some incredible examples of this new Mark VII Marine. It was this same year that would see the release of Space Crusade, which also featured multi-part plastic Space Marines in Mark VII armour, and another Jim Byrne Space Marine cover. In White Dwarf 133, the catalogue pages would include a set of Mark VII wearing Space Marine captains designed by Jez Goodwin, and there would also be a wonderful set of Space Marine armour variants, also by Goodwin, that featured Marines wearing each of the now formalised first 5 marks of Space Marine armour history. Before I forget, I also want to mention that there were also a set of Orcs wearing power armour, though they perhaps lack the panache of their Marine equivalents. And of course, there would also be a great many Renegade Chaos Marine versions of the Space Marines and their power armour over the years. This was far from the end of the evolution of Space Marines armour, but with the arrival of Mark VII, the definitive Space Marine look had finally been achieved. By the time the second edition of Warhammer 40,000 was released in 1993, the Marines had returned to plastic, but this time they were in their updated gear, and both the game and the Space Marines would skyrocket in popularity as a result. In 1997, Jez Goodwin drew a full-size, 8-feet-tall Space Marine in power armour on a wall. Whether this was a random act of tactical vandalism or part of the design process for the life-sized Space Marine statue that was created to guard GWHQ is unclear. What is clear, though, is that this giant illustration and that imposing statue, which still stands near the entrance to Warhammer World, were monuments made in honour of one of 40k's most important, enduring, and iconic designs. Even as things continue to change, iterate, and evolve, some 40 years later, the silhouette of the Space Marine in power armour remains as impressive as ever. The later history of Space Marines and their power armour would see a great many more variations and different miniatures, and of course, there would be a brand new scale as well with the introduction of the Primaris Marines. That is a lot of history that would be really fun to explore, but would take a very, very long time, I expect. I have started a history of 40k, beginning with the first edition, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. You can watch that on the channel right now. If you would like to see me continue that and explore the later editions, the supplements, and other stuff that came out for 40k over the years, please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from you. And of course, if you would like to support the work that I do here, please do consider checking out my Patreon, do like the video, subscribe to the channel. Everything is an enormous help. I would love to keep doing this work forever, but I can't do it without your support, so thank you so much for that. I hope that you have enjoyed this brief history of the earliest origins and first iterations of Space Marine Power Armor in 40k. I had a lot of fun making it, so I hope you enjoyed watching it too. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Honestly, I've got to say powered armor, I think that's the superior term. Power armor is cool, powered armor is just cooler.